because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
As of this moment, they're on double secret probation.
Elvis has left the building.
Schreck Talk is back after a pardon for possible crimes committed against the United States was granted by President Ford, and we're here to bring you the 1970s.
It's a shame you can't see a head shake on the, like, hear a head shake, because that was just so bad. I can't believe, like, you started to
I had to think of something, right?
Yeah, I guess we got to start somewhere, and no matter how bad it is, it's got to go.
Yeah, so we're here discussing our decades, and we're discussing right now the 1970s. We did the 1960s last time, and we're now here to discuss the 1970s, obviously. So what are your general thoughts, Mr. Joshua, on the 1970s?
Complicated era. There's a lot of things I'm not a huge fan of that have kind of become hallmarks, trademarks of some of my fandom, and I feel it's kind of when the two decades it's forced between. It's just kind of somewhere's got to. That's the chasm, chasm.
I don't know, one of them.
Chasm between them.
You know, it's really a weird decade. In a lot of ways, I love the 1970s. In a lot of other ways, the 1970s really sucked. So I'm really looking forward to getting into talking about the 70s, what was good, what was bad, and just kind of exploring the 1970s. I've always been fascinated by the 1970s. Our parents graduated high school, so they were at that key point in the 1970s. So it's always been something that's been with us since we were children.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people identify with their teens and their early 20s as a really memorable part of their lives.
It's like it's my time.
As you get in it, yeah, and you associate with that, and definitely that's where the era our parents are from. So, but when I looked into it, when we started, especially when I thought about it and started doing research, I just felt, compared to some of the other decades that we're going to discuss, it kind of was lacking in a lot of ways, and it was probably I haven't finished all my other ones research yet, but I think this one might be at the bottom for me.
And the 1970s really was a negative decade. I mean, the big issues of the day were always negative. I mean, you didn't get in the 70s. I mean, where was the 70s equivalent of the moon landing or the JFK election? There wasn't one. The 70s were kind of just, they were a stopgap.
Yeah, there was no
between
hope.
The 60s and the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all there really was. Countries around the world were struggling. Economically, it was a really dark time for a lot of places. And, even the higher up places, the United States, the USSR, most of Europe, were still in an economic depression. It was kind of a bad decade for most people. All the great stuff that had happened in the 60s kind of died out by the early 1970s. And in the 1970s, it just kind of was there. That's about all it was.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt about it, and there's something, I have a way of describing how I feel about it that I'll get to a little bit later in our discussion. Once we hit that section, there's something I think that kind of relates, and it's a really good example of my sentiment.
Yeah, and I think the 1970s can really be summed up with Jimmy Carter's malaise speech in 1979. So let's just talk about some of the current events of that decade. the Cold War, which was, in the height in the 1960s, and you had the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War, all this stuff going on, you kind of got into what's called détente in the Cold War in the 1970s. Leonid Brezhnev was the premier of the Soviet Union, and we had, the presidents were Nixon, Ford, and Carter throughout the decade of the 70s.
Gerald Ford.
I don't know what that's from.
It's from The Simpsons.
Okay. So, the Vietnam War ended with the fall of Saigon and the South Vietnamese surrendering on April 30th, 1975. So, as big as the Vietnam War was in the 1960s, it kind of was. By this point, everybody gotten used to the Vietnam War, and it was kind of a second page, third page, fourth page story.
Well, I don't know about that.
It was still pretty popular.
There was a giant protest in like 71 or something like that, 72, with like 12,000 protesters getting arrested. That's just how many got arrested. During so there was definitely a lot of...
It was still important.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like it was in the 60s.
You kind of settled into a routine, but there was definitely still a strong sentiment among, especially young people, against it. But yeah, I definitely could see it wasn't as flashy in your face, but there was still a lot of moments that affected, were part of the Vietnam War that I think kind of get forgotten. Even I didn't know about that this mass protest in Washington until I was actually doing research on it.
Well, and I didn't actually. I don't remember when it was, but we actually left Vietnam. We were starting to, once Nixon came into office in '68, we did ramp up a little bit with like linebacker and linebacker 2 operations. But, as the 70s wore on, we were kind of decreasing the amount of people that were there and stuff like that. And we were actually, by the time of the fall of Saigon, we were already out of there, and we'd been out of there for a while.
Well, and it really started, in 1970, we entered Cambodia, if I recall. And that brought it up a little bit, but then right after that, it started to kind of decline all the way until, the fall of Saigon, obviously, which was a pretty phenomenal event.
So you also get the Watergate scandal here in the United States. Richard Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974 because of the Watergate scandal, and we still don't know.
72, I think the break-in was.
I think it was during the election time.
Yeah, 72.
Yeah, he broke into the Watergate hotel, whatchamacallits, and all of this stuff was found out by Deep Throat. But so we had the Nixon resignation in 1974. So you really get a hit on the culture of the United States, and I think that's a big deal for the 70s. In the 1960s, there was still a very strong United States kind of patriotism that was going on.
National pride.
Yeah. By 1975, the middle of the decade, that was really not... You couldn't really find that much anymore, except for in the very older generation, that generation that had fought in World War II. People were tired, and a lot of things were going on that were just not to most people's liking.
And it's funny because you mentioned 75. Well, in 76 we had a pretty big event that here in America that we don't really talk about now. But if you think about it, we had the bicentennial celebrating 200 years as a country. And thinking of where we were when the country started, where we were when the country was at that point, and you're looking at it, and a lot of people are searching for what's our identity as a country anymore. We're starting to become much more, at least from a historical standpoint, in the way people view our country, much more fractured. And individualized than we had ever really been, and I think that was really seen. Obviously we had the Civil War, so not that much, but that was still two sides that most people on those sides agreed with those sides. Now we're starting to see lots of different people separating into different groups, and America had a lot of people who believed a lot of different things at this point. It was kind of just, exactly, this loss of patriotism, this us trying to find our identity, I think was a big part of the 70s. And I think you'll see that reflected when we talk about the 80s and the politics in that era.
Yeah, things really changed in the 80s, but in the 70s things were pretty depressing.
Yeah,
and there's a worldwide economic upheaval in industrialized countries because of many things. But one of the big things was the oil embargo. That really hit the world. The world ran on oil. The industrialized world
runs.
It still does. Yeah. You're right. It still does to this day. Runs on oil, and it was a big deal back then. Even much more so now, but still, that really caused a lot of problems across the industrialized world in the 1970s, and you can see it just kind of around the world. The Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution.
The Islamic Revolution was 79, I believe, in Iran. It was a huge deal. I mean, you look at their, like, it's something you'll see commonly as pictures from the era before it happened in the early 70s and the 60s, and it was very much like looking at pictures from somewhere in America or any other Western culture, and then definitely very different.
And it's still not the same to this day.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I mean, there's still a big part of their culture,
and then
obviously.
Right after that, you had the Afghanistan invasion by the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union.
And right before the decade ended in December of 1979, there was wars in most of Africa, Asia, the Middle East.
79. I mean, in 79 you had Saddam becoming the president in Iraq. I mean, like, everything was kind of starting to set off these things that we're still now dealing with in the world. They were all really coming to fruition, having built up over the last couple of decades in these places.
It was kind of the culmination of the fallout from World War II.
Yeah, essentially where everything was leading, we finally are starting to hit these moments, and the advances in technology. Can't ignore what's coming up. The computer's starting to come around. The microprocessing chip came out in the early 70s. Microsoft and Apple came out in the mid 70s. You had so many investments. The first mobile phone. All these things that are now part of our lives are starting to happen.
Thanks to Star Trek.
Not just Star Trek.
Mobile phone,
but think of the things we talked about in the 60s with the advances in technology for the space race, that this constant pushing of trying to get, and we're starting to take leaps and bounds in the 70s.
Yeah, that space race was the reason why a lot of those things started to come out in the public in the 1970s.
Oh yeah, and we started taking these leaps and bounds.
Yes.
By the end of the 70s, I think in like 1980, no, I think it might have even been 79 or so, the CD was invented. I'm not about positive.
Yeah, it was about 10 years later that it became popular. But
yeah, but it finally was. We're seeing these advances in technologies, things that are changing the world, which is helping us grow as we're becoming this world, starting to become this world culture where things that happen in America, where the next day it's the news. In Iran, we're talking about the Islamic Revolution and the incident in Tehran with the embassy, where they stormed the embassy and took all the hostages.
The hostages.
I mean,
if you want to see a really good story about that, watch the movie Argo. Won Best Picture a few years ago. It's a really good idea of what was going on at that time in Iran, and you can kind of, it's hard to look back on something and understand it having not been there, but that movie does a really good job of putting you in that place at that time.
Yeah, and so I think you can see how the building blocks of our modern world that had started in the 60s, and obviously started, they've been building over since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but we're starting to take much quicker steps, much more advances, and I think you're going to see these things speeding up as we go through these decades. I think that's something you and I hadn't even talked about starting where we are in the 60s, and we talk about the technology to get to the moon, to what happens in the 70s, what happens like in the 80s. As we go through them, we're going to see these things, and we hadn't even considered that. And I mean, you see how that connects the world. I mean, when we talk about the news of, we didn't talk about the Apollo 13, how it became this news story, and how news is now going to become this instant modern thing. Seeing pictures from the war. Vietnam is the first time we started seeing pictures from the battle lines so people could see what war was really like. And it's something that really shaped everything else we're going to talk about is shaped by these advances in our world that are happening, and the I don't even know how to describe it. What was happening in our culture and every culture as well in the world. It was shaping.
Yeah, and
now.
I kind of want to go back to that, like that turmoil that was going on in the world. If you look at the terrorism before 1970. It was kind of non-existent. I mean, there was a few issues here and there, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. Between 1970 or after 1970, it was huge. And that's something that we deal with every single day now in America.
Oh, yeah. Domestic, foreign, everywhere.
Yeah, everywhere deals with that now, and it's kind of got its start in the early 1970s.
It's become the new normal.
Yeah, I know, the Munich 1972 Olympics. That was a big deal that happened, and it's just, you can see the change in the world from this this early world that we had to what we have kind of now, and that really did kind of happen in the 1970s.
Yeah. But, so that was the world, and obviously then everything else we're now going to talk about is going to kind of be shaped by all these things. Again, same thing in every decade. What's going on in the world, what's going on is going to affect all the things we share this fandom on, movies, TV, music, sports.
All the pop culture stuff.
All the pop culture stuff. So with that in mind...
So we'll kind of go to the music now. Really, the 1970s was kind of a mixed bag when it comes to music. I feel that there was great music, amazing music in the early 1970s, but in the late 70s, it was bad music. I don't know what had happened there, but it was, there's a definite divide in between, and even between the 1960s and 1970s. Right around 1970, you get the start of metal.
Hard rock and metal, absolutely, That you get
Sabbath. Sabbath's record was released in the 13th of February 1970.
Yeah.
And that kind of gives you that dividing line right there between 1960s music and 1970s music. And then you get into the later part of the decade, so things get a little bit more decadent, with the arrival of metal. And then you get into the punk atmosphere, and you get into disco of the late 1970s. Disco is all about partying and having a good time, and punk's about rebellion, and they're rebelling against the metal musicians, the rock musicians who were so popular.
Well, and beyond that, though, you got to look at what's going on in the mainstream. We had the soft rock movement essentially becoming a thing. People like Barry Manilow and Elton John dominating the raveways. You got Rod Stewart,
Chicago.
These are the people. Jim Croce and John Denver were huge. These people, that's the mainstream music that we're not really so much into ourselves. But that was what was dominating the airwaves as well. And yes, in our realm, we were talking about how the birth of metal and all these hard rock bands. Even some that are forgotten. Like I'm a huge Blood Rock fan and stuff like that. Where you're having this really modern sound, and obviously we're not even really going to mention him just yet, but somebody obviously we're going to be discussing here coming about in the early 70s, becoming a big thing. And then we had Kiss, and arena rock was, and that was what we were. But, that's the early 70s. It all kind of
started with in April of 1970. So this is only 3 months into the decade. You get the death, pretty much the start of the death of the Love Generation, with the break of the Beatles.
Yeah, the Beatles were one of the biggest events.
We talked ad nauseum about them in our last episode, how important they were, and they broke up 4 months into the 1970s.
Yeah. And even though they had really kind of broken up in in '69, but
it wasn't an internet culture. They didn't know.
Yeah.
And then you get the death of Jimi Hendrix on the 18th of September 1970, and Jim Morrison dying on the 3rd of July, 1971. That was the death, and Janis Joplin's in there too as well.
Yeah.
You get the death of the Love Generation, the start of this hard rock, rebellious, metal generation.
Well, not even that. I think of more of it as like rock and roll as a musical entity, a force that's in culture that had happened. Because like I was saying, arena rock, I wouldn't call a band like Leonard Skinner really, really hard rock or metal, but they definitely are very rocking. A southern rock sound. That was a whole genre in itself. But
would you call Led Zeppelin?
Yeah, well, yeah,
hard
Zeppelin
rock,
is
metal?
considered generally hard rock. Some people even call them metal. I wouldn't, but
their third album through their really last album were all released in the 1970s.
Yeah, but you had Queen. That's not metal. That's arena rock. This I think the term that became popular during the late 60s was album oriented rock. Where it was these bands having...
And we talked about it last time, how important the album became, the long play record.
Yeah, absolutely.
How important that became in the 1960s because of the Beatles.
Yeah, and records became a thing. Thinking about it, think about one of the greatest albums of all time ever made, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. It was a whole movement. It was a feel. It wasn't just like... This isn't something you just casually throw on in the background. This is something you sit down and you listen to.
It was an experience.
Yeah.
And that started with the Beatles, and I think it hit its really stride in the early 1970s. And then there was a change in the late 1970s. I mean, in the early 60s you had, like I said, Led Zeppelin, or in the early 70s you had like Led Zeppelin, you had Black Sabbath, you had shock rock like Kiss, the New York Dolls, Iggy Pop, and
I think
Alice Cooper.
It's too early, man. I was saving it until the very end.
Yeah, we got to mention Alice Cooper though.
That was going to be the whole cap on the end there, man. That's like
we're planning something big for Alice Cooper right now, so just stay tuned because we're going to be doing something about that. You get Rush and Lynyrd Skynyrd, like you said. I mean,
AC/DC, like
this was all big, and it started in the early 70s, and then you hit 1974, and that's when disco, the dreaded disco, starts to rise. And you know what? Doing research into disco showed me how worthless of a genre this is. It started, it hit its peak, and it died quicker than anything I can think of.
Okay, and here's what I'm saying. I have grown to like disco. I don't think it's this is the way I define it. Hard rock was a thing. It was a popular in thing for a while, and then it stopped being an in thing. It didn't disappear completely, but yes, the bands that were there, because they weren't as popular, and this was a different kind of era than we have, in the later years, where you could still be making music and not be popular. They had to try and stay relevant and be popular, especially in the genres we listen to. You listen to like some of the late Sabbath albums. There, people were complaining they were has-beens, and punk was the new aggressive kind of music. But I think what it means really is that music went from being popular and being what was in the mainstream, and then it was replaced by things like disco and soft rock, and it stopped being a thing. It didn't go away, but it's what became it. That was its era. That was the era when it was in. That's why classic rock radio was such a big thing. That's why you hear these soundtracks for movies like Guardians of the Galaxies, and they have all these soft rock and hard, classic rock songs now. That was this era. Even the music in the mid '70s was that thing.
But you don't see like disco had its number. The second time it ever hit number one on the charts was 1974. By 1977, when Saturday Night Fever came out, it was the hottest thing around. Okay? By the end of the decade, nobody cared about it. I actually looked it up, and it was like they had 6 records in the top 10 in July 1979, and 2 months later in September, they had none. There wasn't a single disco record in the top 10. It died so quick. It was ridiculous.
People are fickle.
I don't know what the cause of that was, but and I've never had respect for disco. I'm sorry, don't screw with my disco, Nadine. I've never been that way. Okay, so hearing that, it's surprising. It was surprising to me. When you think of the '70s, you think of disco.
I think a lot of people do, and I think that's unfair on disco.
It came, it got huge, and then it died really quickly.
But I think its legacy lives on in the dance music culture we have nowadays. It
does, but it's not disco.
It's not disco, but disco had its moments. It was its time in the sun, and it deservingly belonged there. And I've grown to appreciate disco. But we haven't even talked about some of the other things like the R&B and the funk that was starting to happen. James Brown was at his high points in this era. You had Kool and the Gang and Earth, Wind and Fire, and stuff like Marvin Gaye and the R&B side.
And we haven't even focused on the punk craze either. It never got as big as disco, but it was still a big thing, and it was a rebellion kind of thing against those rock musicians like Aerosmith, like Led Zeppelin, like Alice Cooper and Kiss. And punk got really big too, but it never got to the heights of disco. But it was definitely, you look at it, and the early 70s are the hard rock era. The late 60s are disco and punk, and it's like 1975 was a complete dividing line right in the middle there.
I was still trying to talk about R&B.
All right, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, that was a big thing too. You gotta, these aren't genres we are huge into, but they had a movement going on at this time, And punk is gonna. I think punk's died out more than R&B and funk. Obviously, those genres. I mean, funk has would lead into hip hop and rap. We'd see later. R&B is still a huge genre on its own. I mean, we'll as we go through the decades, we'll obviously see some big names in there. But there's these legends, Stevie Wonder and stuff like. And that's not even stuff we're into, but like how their music, there's so many, it's like every decade we can name so many artists, and I think it's going to get, my perception as we go through is they're going to kind of get less and less on these big name artists, because we're talking legendary names, and people as we go forward are not going to seem as legendary, not as far out.
Something that we've already mentioned, Alice Cooper, he said, if you look at music and you go back to the 1950s, you can name how many freaking artists. And in the 1960s, a little bit less, but there's still a lot of great artists out there. 1970s, a little bit less. 1980s, and it keeps getting less as the decades go by.
Part of it is we'll see more more artists coming out, and it's just the same as if you have to pick one movie out of 5 movies or one movie out of 500 movies. It's a lot easier to pick when there's 1 in 5, and it's a lot easier to get lost.
So we've spent a lot of time on music. Let's kind of move over to movies now. This is your key point.
One last thing here. Alice is the best. He hit his high point in the 70s. We'll get into that. If you even listen to us, you'll have plenty in store. You're going to be full of Alice, so we're not even going to continue talking.
Yeah, we're going to have like 15 hours worth of Alice coming.
Yeah.
So just get ready for that.
All right,
let's talk to movies. This
is my thing here.
Your bread and butter.
My bread and butter. It's what
your
I
Humpty's hoagie.
Good one, I guess. And earlier I said there was something I was going to say that kind of sums up how I feel about the 70s. And it comes to movies, and it's how I describe how I feel about most of the movies in the 70s. They feel gritty. They feel grainy. They feel the colors are off on them. The clothes are off. They feel very odd. Some of the movies I think of that I would say really inspire this feeling in me. Of the that grittiness, or stuff like French Connection and stuff where you just the whole way everything felt, it just, that's how I sum up the decade. And I think even the movies I love, like the Exorcist. Let's start off with the genre. I'm a huge fan of the horror genre in the 70s. Really, after '68, we mentioned the modern horror film with Night of the Living Dead. You're really going to see that expand in the 70s.
Well, you see modern movies, period, expand in the 1970s.
Yeah. Oh, the
not just modern horror.
Yeah, yeah. Well, obviously, as you're going to see that as we go through it, we'll start talking about all the different things, summer blockbusters, and all of these things. But with horror, you had, even The Exorcist and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Omen and Halloween, even in '78. From the beginning of the decade to the end of the decade, it just felt raw and, I don't know, dirty. I don't. Those movies, I love them, but they just have that sense to them. I don't know. Do you feel anything like this when you watch them?
I feel there's some rawness to them, and I think that's part of the appeal to some of them. The Exorcist, I don't feel as raw. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, definitely. Halloween, definitely. But Alien, no, I feel like Alien's a blockbuster, and that one came out in 1979.
I still watch that, and the way the costumes are, the way it's filmed.
There's I forget what it's called, but it kind of started with Star Wars was the first biggest hit, and that came out in May 1977, where you have this used future. So a lot of science fiction movies took that into their mold, and that's what you get a lot from Alien, Ridley Scott's Alien, is you get that used future. It's not bright and shiny like 2001. It's dark, it's used. Dark Star by John Carpenter was one of the first films to use that. So you get that, and you do get some of that in the horror. Like I said, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974, October, right before Halloween. It's not the movie Halloween, the holiday Halloween in 1974. There's that grittiness to it, and that was part of the appeal of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and still to this day, that is one of the most real, and it feels like a documentary sometimes. So you do get that a lot in the 1970s, especially with those horror movies. Dawn of the Dead.
Dawn of the Dead
came out in 1978 in actually in Europe, 79 in the United States.
It's 78.
Yeah, it's a 78 movie.
That was when it came out.
So you get that grittiness, you get that rawness, but you also get something like Star Wars or Jaws in 1975.
Okay, so well, you're obviously segueing into my next thought: the summer blockbuster becoming a thing. You know, and I think there's a few films that are really important to mention in this. You had Jaws, obviously the first real summer movie. If you know anything about it, like summer was the dumping ground of films until Jaws came out, and after they saw how huge it was,
I think it came out on the 20th of June, 1975.
After everyone saw how big it was, it became this thing, and obviously 2 years later, as you mentioned, we had Star Wars in '77. Like in '78, the big summer movie was Jaws 2. I think that's also an important thing to point out.
That is. I didn't even realize that. And that's some of the research I've done. It doesn't even come down to that because that was the first huge sequel kind of thing. And you didn't really get much of that until the 1980s and especially the 1990s and 2000s.
Yeah. We'll see that become a big thing. And so the summer blockbuster becoming the thing to do. And, you know, even though it wasn't a summer movie, films like Superman was a huge
78
cultural, like, oh, we gotta go see Superman. Finally, he's on the big screen.
Think about the next Ant-Man or Doctor Strange or
the first
Avengers movie.
Really big superhero film release.
Was Superman in 1978.
Consider it one of the greatest, if not the greatest, film release in the superhero genre. Obviously, compared to the modern stylistics, it's very different. But at the time, it was a really big deal. And you even saw, not just in the summer blockbusters, and I think you see the seeds of the summer blockbusters in the beginning of the decade with all like the disaster films like Airport in 1970, Poseidon Adventure in '72. I mean, you had The Towering Inferno, all of these big adventure action stories, and kind of setting up the summer blockbuster.
They were really, it seemed like they were building up to the blockbuster that became Jaws.
And I think, it's the things we talk about. San Andreas coming out a while back, a couple of years ago with The Rock, and all the big ones in the 90s, and Twister, and disaster films are still a big genre.
They're kind of summer blockbuster. They're kind of dying out now.
Yeah, they're not
I
as
think people
popular.
are kind of tired of them, but they're a huge genre.
Yeah, it still is.
Twister, 2012, The Day After Tomorrow. These are all movies that people come to see. It's a spectacle. It's popcorn films.
And that really became a thing in the 70s. I think you really noticed that. But in the early 70s, I think it was a little different. You still kind of start finding their ground with that new Hollywood. Films like French Connection, as I mentioned, The Godfather, obviously, Clockwork Orange, these films that...
By the way, don't care for The Godfather. Never seen The French Connection, actually. Love Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, how about Serpico?
Never seen Serpico.
Yeah,
I think I own it, but I've never seen it.
It's one of them genres I'm not into myself personally. I have never been a fan. I don't
like that new Hollywood feel either.
Yeah,
it's not. I mean, it's artsy fartsy kind of independent films with a budget, and they just and a lot of them don't appeal to me. Woody Allen films don't appeal to me.
Yeah, and so this is something I wasn't big on, and so obviously not really something I'm going to talk much about. Moving on past that, you had some great fantasy kind of stuff coming out with Wizards and the Lord of the Rings rotoscope film. In the late 70s, you had the blaxploitation era starting to become a thing. My favorite version of that is the Sweetback's Badass Song. It came out, and it was this huge thing that the mainstream Hollywood had to rebound and make films like Shaft and Superfly. And
well, I think a very important thing that you mentioned last episode that I didn't even consider is the grindhouse cinema, the MPAA. Or the Hollywood Code, whatever they had in the 1960s, got lifted in 1968, and that's when you started to see the grindhouse films, the sexploitation, not blaxploitation, which had a lot of those in that.
Yeah, like that would lead to that. They would kind of lead to the genre.
Yeah, you had a lot of violent movies starting to come out, a lot of sexy movies.
Midnight Cowboy won Best Picture with an X rating.
Yeah, it's you really see a change and. We mentioned this word a couple times early on, the decadence of the 1970s. That's where it really started to come on in the 1970s, and this change in culture from this uptight, buzz-cut kind of 1960s mentality to this anything goes kind of 1970s mentality. With movies like Texas Chainsaw and just your grindhouse films.
Yeah, and one of the things funny about that, I mean, moving on a little past movies and into our other kind of half genre with this as television shows, I think you don't really see that reflected as much in the TV of it air, but it starts to happen. So, I mean, think of like the Brady Bunch premiered in 1969, and think of the Brady Bunch through 1974. This wholesome kind of stuff, that was still what was on TV, but you did start to get All in the Family came out in the 70s.
All in the Family ran from 1971 in January to April 1979. All in the Family was this modern day. It was a Married with Children in the 1970s. It was Modern Family in the 1970s. It was a huge change. As far as 70s TV goes, it sucked. I think it really did suck.
I don't know. I mean,
there was some good stuff.
I mean, you had MASH. MASH was a great show. I think MASH is really kind of forgotten.
There were some good episodes. Sanford and Son was good. I enjoyed Sanford and Son.
SNL premiered in 75. I'm a big SNL fan. It's obviously had some up and downs, but, that early era had some good stuff in it.
Chevy Chase, Jim Belushi.
But, I mean, I see what you're saying. There's a lot of shows I didn't care for in the decade, like, Charlie's Angels was a big show. I mean, Little House on the Prairie, Happy Days. There's a lot of shows. Laverne and Shirley, I think, was in the 70s. So, yeah, there was a lot of shows I didn't like. Obviously, it's not my favorite decade on TV. Absolutely, it wasn't. But there was still some good stuff.
It's the only decade where there wasn't Star Trek on TV. That just got to rule out TV
I don't
in
think
the 70s.
There's anything more to say about TV in the 70s. I think you just kind of killed it.
Yeah, I mean, you had the reruns of Star Trek, but that was about it.
Yeah, so I think that sums it up.
So let's move on to sports then.
Yeah, we're gonna start like this one, like we did the last time, and let's just go through the Olympics. Yeah, Olympics obviously are my things. We only had 2 years, only 2 sets. We had the winners in 72 and winners and summers in 72 and 76. So in 72 we had Sapporo, Japan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that. It's the name of that beer you can go buy that isn't that great. And again, we're starting to get into some advancing into the modern era of Olympics and things developing. The last wooden cross-country skis made their appearance in that Olympics because advances in technology were going to happen. I mean, and there was always this controversy over whether athletes should be professional or whether they can be amateur, and this is something that's still kind of going on, I think, and not as big a deal, but at this point it was so big that Canada refused to send their hockey team because the USSR's team was essentially a professional team but allowed to play.
And every other country was playing amateur teams.
Yeah, and I mean, even to the point where the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, was getting ready to disqualify like 40 alpine skiers because of having endorsements. So, I mean, definitely that was the main thing going on at this time, is a lot of concern over what's an athlete, how are these people, training and stuff. But, obviously if we're going to talk about the Olympics in 72, there's really only one thing. You've already mentioned it. Only one thing we can mention, which takes place during the Summer Olympics that happened in Munich, Germany, West Germany, 1972. The massacre of the Israeli athletes. I think it was 11 of them, of trainers and athletes killed, something like that.
That's the start of that terrorism.
Yeah.
A bunch of Arabs went in and killed a bunch of Israeli, athletes at the Olympics. And, I really didn't know a whole lot about this until Steven Spielberg's movie Munich came out, which really focuses on
It's not even really about it.
It's not.
It's about what happens after.
Yeah, it's the start of the movie, and then you follow what happens afterwards. If you look at that, I mean, 72 could kind of be considered the first modern Olympics, with that kind of stuff going on. So in the 1970s really was the transition to the modern, and
you know why I'm going to say I agree with that? That was the first year they had an officially named mascot as well. It was Waldy. It was a dachshund. So
I love dachshunds.
Yeah, I love dachshunds. So obviously
we got a couple of them.
Yeah, so I obviously, when you point at modern, it kind of, if you want to get into it, yeah, that really kind of is another example. But if I have to say something, obviously I don't want to, we kind of touched on it earlier, the terrorism, what happened. I mean, obviously, if you're not familiar with it, look it up. But I want to at least say something about the sports that happened. And so if I had to pick, a thing that was kind of a big deal, the U.S. basketball team lost to the USSR. and they actually refused. It's considered the most controversial basketball game in Olympic history. They refused their silver medals, and they're still in a vault somewhere. I mean, they're not. They never took them. Like not a single one of them accept them because they
Why
felt
was that?
Because there was these calls they had to they played the last 5 seconds of the game or something 3 times, and they were winning the time when the time expired the first time, and what happened rest I don't know, but it ended up USSR won, and they were like, no, we were robbed, so they never accepted their medals. So that was 72. Obviously, we're not really going to talk about the sports in that.
So what happened in 76?
76, we had Innsbruck, which was in Austria for the winter, which was not actually supposed to be there. It was their second time playing in the 12 years because Denver dropped out of. Denver was supposed to host those Olympics, and they actually dropped out, so Innsbruck got it again. Innsbruck, Austria, had a second time in 12 years. But you really started to see modern technology coming in the ski suits, the technology they wore, the helmets, everything. It was really becoming how we think of the modern Olympics in this one. And again, USSR continuing to dominate in hockey, 4th straight win. Canada once again not sending athletes because of them considering the USSR pro and amateur athletes being required. But, moving into the end of the decade, obviously we had the Montreal, which is a pretty controversial one. And again, we're going to start seeing the same repeating patterns here again, where we have, issues of corruption, issues of money being spent extensively. I mean, I think, if you come,
I think Montreal was the first city where paying for the Olympic stadiums and all that stuff, and they saw a huge economic crash after those Olympics.
If you adjust it for inflation, how much the cost of it was, how much the cost overrun specifically, what their estimates were, and they overran it by. The overrun, if you adjust it, is from modern times 720%. Whereas you look at the London 2012, which was one of the biggest modern overruns on spending, it was only 76%. It was a huge deal. So it became this huge thing about spending money. And again, controversy continuing to come. 29 countries boycotted. This is the first time you see a really big boycott in the Olympics. And they boycotted because the IOC let New Zealand's rugby team play. And rugby had played in South Africa. So almost all the only I think 2 African countries played in the Olympics.
Because of the apartheid.
Because of the apartheid in South Africa. And it wasn't even because they allowed South Africa. It's because they allowed New Zealand, who had played against South Africa, who played them against a couple months earlier. And because of that, they did it. But obviously the biggest thing about that, final thing on the Olympics there, Nadia Comaneci, gymnastics is a big thing that got me into the Olympics, getting her perfect 10. And if you watch her videos, it's nothing like watching modern gymnastics. I think it's much more impressive.
So, well, let's go from the Olympics to the major sports in the Americas. So baseball, this was I think the last decade where baseball was America's pastime, America's biggest sport. And in the decade, you had a dominance by the 1972, 73, and 74 Oakland A's dominated and winning 3 World Series in that. You also had the Big Red Machine, who had been to 5 World Series or 6 World Series? No, 4. I just went all kinds of numbers there. But in 4 World Series, and they won in 75 and 76, the Big Red Machine did. And they followed it up with 2 Yankees victories and Mr. October, Reggie Jackson, in the late 1970s, so 77, 78. I think they lost to the Reds in 1976. So you had a lot of, kind of dominant eras. You had the A's, the Reds, and then the Yankees.
Yeah, what year were the Celtics, since I'm not into basketball and baseball?
I honestly think the Celtics
was like the 50s.
Was big in the 60s.
60s, yeah.
And then the 70s was the start of the Laker era.
But yeah, we're seeing these eras
80s
being a thing.
Yeah. And then in football, we'd already discussed, the Super Bowl became, started in the 1960s, but it really became big in the 1970s.
Yeah, we want to talk about teams having big eras there.
Yeah. So we're Pittsburgh fans, and the Pittsburgh Steelers won 4 Super Bowls in the 1970s. 1974, we beat Minnesota. In 1975, we beat the Dallas Cowboys. 1978, Super Bowl 13, we beat the Cowboys again. And then in 1979, the game was actually played in 1980. We actually beat the Los Angeles Rams. So the decade of dominance for for the Steelers was definitely in football, but you also had good runs by the Dolphins, who were in the Super Bowl in 71, 72, 73. They won in 72 and 73 and had the only perfect season ever.
Still to this day.
Still to this day in 1972, went 17-0. And then you had the Cowboys, who won in 1971 and 1977, but they were also in it in 1970, 75, and 78 and lost. And two of those were 2-hour Steelers. But then you get into hockey. Hockey started to get a little bit bigger at this time with the arrival of Wayne Gretzky. He changed the game forever, and he came in the late 1970s for the Edmonton Oilers, I believe, just changed hockey forever. And we're going to get into Wayne Gretzky a little bit more in the 1980s when we discuss that.
I don't really like discussing him because I think he's a little bit overrated. But, I mean, obviously his influence cannot be...
And he was in an era with high scoring, but, I mean, Wayne Gretzky he's called the Great One for a reason.
Yeah, he has a name. He doesn't necessarily completely deserve it, but he has kind of earned it, I suppose.
And then just another sport I want to mention is boxing. Boxing probably had its highest peak of popularity in the late 70s, or in the 70s, with the late, great Muhammad Ali.
Cassius Clay, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, we talked about him last time. In the Olympics, when he was actually competing in something that mattered.
He had Muhammad Ali had 3 epic battles in the 1970s with Joe Frazier. The Fight of the Century in 1971, the Super Fight 2 in 1974, and in 1975, the Thrilla in Manila. He also had a big battle, the Rumble in the Jungle, considered by some arguably the greatest sporting event of the 20th century.
I think these names are more popular than the matches.
With George Foreman. There's some good matches in there, though. If you watch the Fight of the Century, it's really good. And you watch the third one, the Thrilla in Manila, is really good as well.
I thought we were going to talk about something that mattered like WrestleMania 3, but we'll get there later.
So, he was huge, and boxing was huge in the 1970s. So, I mean, that's really, as far as sports go, you didn't get into that time where you had a diversification of sports like you do now, the Ocho and everything like that. So your big sports, your footballs, your basketballs, your hockeys, Olympics, like you said, was obviously big.
It was starting to really become a thing, actually.
Yeah, and boxing got huge in the 70s. It wasn't as big after that, but in the 1970s it was. So let's kind of just go from here to our final discussion on the culture of the 1970s. I know you didn't have a lot on this, so I'll kind of start out here. Really, the 1970s was the me decade. It was, and this can be exemplified by the first facelifts were done in the 1970s. This all became about me and my personal gratification, whereas, if you look in previous decades, previous eras, it was more about something greater than you, your family or the country or, your job or something like that. But in the 70s, it really became about you or me in this case.
I wouldn't say I completely agree with that. I definitely can see the argument. I think it really started in the 60s as well, too, especially the late 60s. But, that desire to find yourself, and there's always, we can even go back to some of the Transcendentalists and Emerson or whatever and Thoreau. Those guys were all about finding themselves and being about themselves. But it was kind of different. Yeah, I kind of see what your argument is, especially in the late 70s where it was about, partying, having a good time. Drugs were really becoming a big, hard drugs were becoming much more a part of the culture than they were. In the early 70s, you had adult films were being played in the theater and stuff like that. So it was really an odd time.
They were really dark, sticky theaters, though.
Yeah, but not necessarily. You had Johnny Carson going to the premieres of films like Deep Throat and stuff like that. So there was a lot of odd things going on in the time, and when I think of it, I think the movies exemplify it. I think that it's how I feel about the 70s. When I think of what life was probably like in the 70s, I don't think of how beautiful it was in the Brady Bunch. I think of how it was, living on the streets and people getting
You think of Taxi Driver.
Yeah, people getting their shoes stolen and stuff in New York and the crime. I think of late 70s New York crime.
Yeah, and speaking of shoes, you kind of seen this change from this 60s tie-dye, bell-bottom culture to more of a punk and disco fashion. You started to see the big hair, and, disco still had a lot of, the bell-bottoms and stuff like that. punk was completely different. Leather and spikes and spiked hair. It really was a different kind of atmosphere. But, if you take somebody in, 1970 and compare them to 1980, there was a complete difference in what they were wearing. And you can, see a lot of the decadence in that, of the decade.
Yeah, you started to see a lot more revealing clothing, I would say. I think of the disco outfits, some of them, men with very tight clothes, women with very tight clothes, or, missing a lot of things. Men wearing, really wide open shirts, women wearing very wide open
showing
shirts.
Off their chest
both
hair.
Both of them showing
cleavage.
lots of chest. And, so that's kind of, I definitely see that. I think, Saturday Night Fever, as you mentioned, 1977, height of the disco era, really. You think about that, it's kind of a dark movie. People exemplify it like it's just like fun thing. It's really not a fun movie at all. And I think that's kind of how I feel about it. There's another movie called The Last Days of Disco, which is a film with Kate Beckinsale from the 90s and Chloe Sevigny, and it kind of shows this drug party atmosphere of going out and being in weird places, and that's kind of how I think about it. I think about, I think Boogie Nights takes place in the late 70s, and that's kind of the mindset.
You really start to see if you go back to the 1960s and how drug culture was, it's going to free your mind and make all these changes to the world and everything. But then you look at the late 70s and what drug culture has done up to that point.
It was about getting messed up.
It was about getting messed up, and you see the destruction that it caused.
Yeah, and especially going forward, you'll see the Coke era in the 80s, and you'll see
the Coke era started in
ecstasy
disco
in the 90s, and these ideas of getting really messed up kind of started taking their roots. Obviously, we saw the acid in the 60s. I suppose we could do a drug section for each decade, probably.
So one other thing, this is when video games started. You had Pong and stuff like that started to come out, and video games, pinball was big in the early 70s and all the way through, but you kind of see the video games, Atari starting to come out, and this is a huge thing nowadays, but it really started in the 1970s.
Yeah, and I think the arcade kind of became more of the way we think of an arcade. Obviously, there's different definitions of an arcade, but I think of the scene in where they're playing games in Dawn of the Dead in the mall, where with all these games that you look at now and you're like, they're paying to play these games, but those were the games, so that was new, that was cool, this idea of something different. And it wouldn't take long till you'd start seeing these advances. The Atari, I think, came out in 79. So absolutely gaming started to become a thing.
And also with, not only video games, but board games started to peak up. I mean, you really only had a few handfuls. You had card games and stuff like that before this, but one of the big companies was Avalon Hill. They started producing these very complicated war board games and sports board games, and so you started seeing, and it kind of goes back to that me generation kind of thing, where you got video games. It's I can just sit here and play these for hours. Board games, you're just kind of you're not really participating in a group activity. I mean, I love Status Pro Baseball. Status Pro Baseball came out in the 1970s, and it is a game I can play for hours all by myself.
Yeah, but there's also a lot of these games had to have other people, so I don't think it was completely like that. But
it's a very weak comparison.
Yeah.
Stephen King also in the 1970s started to gain popularity. Horror genre, of books started to gain popularity, and it wasn't so much these artsy-fartsy kinds of books that you were seeing.
I would say Stephen King's probably arguably the most important writer of the last 50 years, of all writers.
And it was in the late 1970s with books like Christine. I think The Stand came out in 79 or maybe 80.
I think it might have been 80.
But he had, several books before then that were hugely popular.
This was the beginning of his era.
Yes.
So,
and then I brought this up in the last one. I want to kind of bring this, in the last one, we were talking about the evolution of facial hair. And you kind of see, from the beginning of the decade, it was all clean shaven. Till the late decade, you've seen a lot more beards. And even into the 1970s, you see beards. So the change here is going to be, beards kind of went from, the main thing to mustaches. Mustaches, and still beards, but that decade kind of was the first time since the 1800s, the 19th century, that facial hair became popular again. So, I mean, that kind of gives you, it's very weak, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the 70s were like.
And there's another thing, if you want to think about what the 70s were like, that goes when you say the word stash. goes right before. It's 4 letters and starts with a P. So you should know that exemplifies what the 70s were like. So if you can't figure that out, you're probably too young to be listening to this anyway.
All right, so now let's go back. We're going to revisit all the areas that we've gone through so far and kind of give us our, our worst and our best event of those things. So I'm going to start here for current events. My top event of the decade, actually I'll start with the worst. My worst event of the decade for current events is the resignation of Nixon. Now you're probably going, really? Why? But it is very important. It exemplifies the destruction of the authority figures in the United States, and it's never been the same since. Ever since it was determined that what Nixon had done, we never looked at authority figures. We never looked at the presidency the same way again. So that was my worst event of the 1970s. What's yours?
If I had to pick, there's so many dark moments we could go with. The Munich massacre. We can go with the hostage situation, 3 Mile Island. We didn't even talk about. There's so many events, but I got to go with something that's kind of. I suppose people are going to look at me weird, but I'm going to say the invention of the microprocessor, the invention of the cell phone. These things would forever change our world. In some ways, so much better, but in some ways, they've done so much worse too. And I think this really is when we jump to technology ruling our lives, and it not just
being... This was definitely the start of it.
It was not... Yeah, this was... Exactly. It didn't happen yet. This is the birth of it, really, though. And I think it kind of changed our world irrevocably. I mean, I just read something today, actually, if you want to talk about current events, something today about the ex-president of Facebook coming out and talking about how he thinks it's ruining our kids' brains and stuff like that. So... I got to pick that as my worst. There's so many other things. Obviously, there's so many tragedies we could talk about, but I wanted to pick something that I feel is still having a lasting effect.
All right. So, well, let's reverse this now. Give me your best moment of the decade. Your best current event.
Best current event. Margaret Thatcher becoming prime minister. We'll go with Margaret Thatcher. Can't go wrong with it. Sets up our next episode.
Yes, it does.
And
we'll get into that next time. So my best event of the decade, and like I said in the beginning, the 70s wasn't a whole lot of positive. There wasn't that moon landing or that election of JFK that really changed things. So I just kind of gone with it's not much a positive, but how about the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt? And even though you look at them now and you're like, they really didn't do a whole lot. Compared to what was going on before with the 7 Days War and the Yom Kippur War, it did really reduce tensions in that area. So I would say that's number one for my top event of the decade. So let's go to music now. So what would be your top music event, music moment, whatever, from the decade of the 1970s?
Alice.
I concur, Alice.
And your worst? I mean, there's no more to... Obviously, we know no more to say
We're
going
to get into this later. And how about my worst music of the decade, my worst music event, whatever, is going to be disco.
So wrong.
So vapid, so painful. I can't even explain how much I do not like disco. And just look at the events. It came, got huge, and it died so quickly because it was so empty. Disco.
It was hard not choosing Bowie on my end, but I'm going to go with punk. And if I had to pick a punk band specifically that exemplifies why I don't like punk, I'm going to go with the Ramones. Maybe the Sex Pistols.
Funny, the Ramones are huge Alice. Well, Johnny Ramone
is a
huge Alice Cooper fan.
My issue with punk is how it was viewed. It shaped the music at the time, and the rock and hard rock that we're such fans of was then viewed as uncool and unhip, and the main reason is how it affected those artists and how they felt they needed to change, because at that era you still had to try and stay relevant. You couldn't be a person who made your music on your own and did things like you can nowadays, where you have the ability to record a record at your house that sounds like it was produced in a studio.
And get it out to everybody on MySpace or Facebook or YouTube.
Exactly, iTunes. So I think that was my biggest issue, is how it affected all these artists I loved with its popularity and how they were now seen as has-beens and hags and all of this. So that's definitely my worst for music.
All right, so let's go on to your favorite subject now, movies. Movies and TV.
Movies and TV. Again, these are so important to me. I have to give one for each. I don't know. I know you didn't do that last time. I imagine you're sticking with that this time.
Yes.
But for me, they're so important. Starting with TV, I got to go with Brady Bunch. I love Brady Bunch so much. It's so wholesome. It's so wonderful. I own all 5 seasons. I own the movies. If I could own the variety show from '76, I would own that. But they only it's they didn't put it out. But I love it.
You probably see it on YouTube.
And I also really cartoon TV hated Little House on the Prairie. I remember it was like,
so that's your least favorite.
That's my least favorite. Absolutely hate Little House on the Prairie. So TV, again, TV was not great, and I think Little House on the Prairie still had that wholesome feel that I liked. But I don't know. Maybe I just grew up. Every time it come on, I'd be like, change.
All right, so let me start with my movies.
Yeah.
I'll do my best movie.
Let's hear it.
I'm going to go with my second favorite movie of all time, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Best Picture winner in 1975. Also won Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Director, too. So the top 5, it won those in 1975. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, amazing movie, Jack Nicholson, and Nurse Ratched. How can you not forget Nurse Ratched?
So, of all the films that came out in the 70s, you're going to see, over the next 3 decades, you're going to see my top 3 most influential films in my life. And this one is definitely high on the list. My number 1 movie is The Exorcist, the greatest horror film probably ever made, in my opinion. I don't think anything will ever beat it. And it's so fantastically well done. William Friedkin, off the high train that he had just had, winning Best Picture for French Connection, made this fantastic adaptation of William Peter Blatty's book. And if you haven't seen it, you're living under a rock. I know most audiences feel it might be a little slow, but it's
an amazing movie.
It's so amazing. It's so good.
So, like I said, this is my worst and best movie, or movie and TV show. So I'm gonna have to go movie TV of the decade is gonna be just TV all around, just plain stunk. I mean, there's not one show that came out in the 1970s that I love. There's shows I like, but there isn't a love show in there at all.
I can even agree with that because Brady Bunch premiered in '69. And that's my favorite show of the decade. So, yeah, I can kind of concur on that as well.
All right, so your worst movie then?
Worst, obviously, it's going to be a movie, and it's because I'm tired of everybody telling me I shouldn't love it and I should watch it. And it's this masterpiece. It's not a film. Again, crime movies, not something I'm into, especially mafia films. And The Godfather, I'm tired of having this crammed down my throat. I'm a huge movie buff, and people just can't believe that I don't love The Godfather. And it's because I have no interest in it. I'm not saying it's a bad movie. It's just, again, kind of like last decade, I'm just tired of having to deal with something, which is this. Godfather, I'm tired of it.
And for me, I have to agree with you. I just don't like mafia stuff. So for me, The Godfather just falls empty because I don't really care about mafia stuff.
Yeah. So, and now moving on to sports, obviously my moments here are going to be from the
Olympics.
The Olympics, and, obviously the worst moment for sports for me in the decade would have to be the massacre of the Israeli athletes at the '72 Olympics. It was such a horrific event. It really shaped the whole event, the whole Olympics. There's never been anything else like that. Anything as tragic at an Olympic event. So obviously that's my worst moment of the decade in sports. What's yours?
All right, so I am really sick and tired. And it started in the 1970s, reached its peak in the 1990s, and it's still said today, and I frickin' hate it. America's team. You're the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys. You're not America's team. Okay? I'm so sick and tired of that moniker. I can't even begin to express. And the fact that the Steelers beat the Cowboys twice in that decade, it's just kind of icing on that cake because we shoved it right into the face of those arrogant jerks in Dallas. We're America's team. Bull crap. I hate America's team, and let's move on to our best.
I actually had a good rebuttal, but with the strength and the conviction of your statement, I am just going to move on. My best moment, I got to go with the '72 Olympics again. Friggin' Waldy, the dachshund, the mascot. That's so awesome. Like, I love dachshunds. I love the Olympics. What more can I ask for? Like, it's my favorite type of dog in my favorite sports in Germany. A great country. Obviously, it's weighed down by the events, so kind of brings it back for the '72 Olympics. Go Waldy.
And I'm going to go back to my worst team. Check out for my best, Super Bowl 13. Frickin' the Steelers and the Cowboys. At that point, they were the teams of the decade. Both had won 2 Super Bowls. This was the first time that they were going to face off for the victor, or with the victor getting a 3rd Super Bowl. So it was and if you watch the game, it is an amazing game. I don't want to spoil it for you, but the Steelers win.
Oh, I'm shocked. So, well, now we got to move on to our last.
Let's move on to culture. I know you probably. I don't remember you having anything for this last time.
I have something, but I want to hear. I have a best and a worst as well. So, I'll go ahead and start off with, if I had to pick what do you want to say? Best or worst? What would you prefer?
Let's go with the best.
The best. So if I had to pick the best part of our culture, arena rock, album-oriented rock, the Pink Floyds, the Kisses, the Alice, the Rush, my favorite,
Aerosmith, the Zeppelins,
exactly, the era of these traveling bands and fans be going around. Obviously it started in the 60s, but it became this thing of these giant tours where bands had these great spectacles, and you could go out and watch your rock show. It was an event going to a rock show.
So you're kind of taking this because it's kind of a music thing, but you're kind of taking it as a culture thing. It was part of the culture
of going to concerts. I think of my mom talking about sneaking in to see Aerosmith and going to watching Kiss as a kid, and all of these events that she had. And that's such a big part of my life is going to concerts. I would say that's definitely a culture thing that kind of started to be this going to see bands and thinking. I think of Detroit Rock City, of them trying to go see Kiss and how big that was in their life and stuff. And that's kind of became a culture thing of like, I love my bands. I love how exposed they are. I want to go see their big rock show. And I like that. That was my biggest in the culture, is the traveling to go see bands and these events.
So I'm going to say my biggest culture event, and I did mention it earlier, we didn't talk a whole lot about it, but it's Avalon Hill board games. Avalon Hill was the company that started making them. They started making these really complicated board games, and I absolutely love complicated board games. I hate your Monopolies, your Lifes. Party games are okay for a party, but I really kind of get into and find a lot of enjoyment from Avalon Hill board games. And I know our father played a lot of those. He got me one for Christmas a few years ago. I'm still trying to get into that. It's a really complicated game called Rise and Decline of the Third Reich. But Avalon Hill board games, number one. This is the rise of the important board games. So worst moment, worst culture?
Worst cultural moment is just, again, I talk about the Olympics and how it really reflects the decline of our values and the decline of, the way we view the world as this special place, and we're starting to see this darker thing. So my biggest thing in the culture of the 60s is this, again, gritty, the dark nature of how we're starting to see our world as this, instead of this hopeful place, the culture of this is the world and I'm just going to exist in it. You would say maybe the me generation. I don't define it as that so much as the world is this horrible place and I don't have to try and make it a better place anymore. So the culture of acceptance, I guess, would be a good way to describe it.
All right, so my worst of the decade as far as culture goes is disco fashion. I hate disco fashion.
Man, why do you hate disco so much?
They bastardized the cool, 60s tie-dye, bell-bottom, or hip-hugger, whatever, fashion of the 60s and the early 70s, and they destroyed it. And it was so depressing. If you look at how cool people dressed in the 1970s, early 1970s, and then you look at what they did during the disco era, the chains, the hairy chests, showing off the chest, period. It was depressing and disappointing.
I just want to watch Detroit Rock City now to see all this disco fashion. I love disco.
So let's take a look at some of our so now we're going to do with we're going to kind of finish it up here. Our pick of the week.
Oh yeah, of course. You gotta go with something here that kind of hits on a couple of things. Got into it a few years ago. I'm sure if you're the one person who's ever listened to this, you might have heard that big Pink Floyd fan recently got into an album of theirs called Obscured by Clouds, which was the album they put out right before Dark Side of the Moon. It's not even really. It's considered a soundtrack. It's for
some
French
weird
film.
French film.
Yeah, and I even own this book about all Pink Floyd albums, and it's the only one they ignore. So it's kind of this missing gem, and it's really good. It's like a straightforward rock and roll album. There's like 4 instrumentals on it, which kind of might throw a lot of people off. It doesn't bother me at all. I think it's got one of my favorite Pink Floyd songs on it, in Childhood End. I think there's some good work by Roger Waters. I think, there's a great song by Rick Wright. I think it's got a good album, and it sets up. It's the last like normal album, Pink Floyd album, before they got into the monsters that would become everything they did after Dark Side.
So my pick of the week is going to be not something released in the 70s, but something that heavily focuses in the 1970s, and that is the movie Dazed and Confused. Richard Linklater.
94.
Yep.
Might have been 93, but I think it was 94.
And this movie kind of shows you what I love about the 70s. Like I said, I love and I hate the 70s, and this movie really gives you what I love about the 70s. The cool cars, the fashion, just daily life, unencumbered by cell phones and computers. The music is amazing. So go check out 1994's Richard Linklater's 1994 Dazed and Confused.
I'm sure you'll hear me talk about it.
All right, so next time we got coming up for you is going to be the 1980s.
I hope you got a couple hours to spend with us on that one.
Go away or I shall taunt you a second time.